Prime Minister Winston Churchill, American President Franklin Roosevelt, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin gathered at Tehran in November and December 1943. It marked the first meeting between Roosevelt and Stalin. The Tehran Conference was one of only two wartime meetings between the Big Three Allied leaders. Its overarching purposes were for the Big Three to determine the best way to relieve Wehrmacht pressure on the Soviet Union and decide the when and where of an Allied operation to open a second front in Europe. The decisions made at Tehran deeply impacted the conduct of the war and the post-war world. The decisions made at Tehran were said by Robert E. Sherwood to be one of momentous decisions. One cannot read these deliberately dry and guarded accounts without the feeling that here were titans determining the future course of an entire planet. This was indeed the Big Three. The Big Three came to Tehran with the knowledge that their decisions would impact the future of the world and the lives of millions. In 1943, the Soviet Union was absorbing the full force of Wehrmacht pressure on the Eastern Front. Joseph Stalin looked to the United States and Britain for much-needed relief. Toward that goal, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Quebec in August 1943. There, they committed to a cross-channel invasion set to occur in the spring of 1944, following the conclusion of the Italian campaign. The main reasoning and hope for the cross-channel invasion was to force the German army to move between 30 and 40 divisions from the Eastern Front, relieving the Red Army. In the 8 weeks between the Quebec Conference and the Tehran Conference, where D-Day decisions were finalized, Winston Churchill, who was having second thoughts about giving primacy to Overlord, the code name for an Allied operation to invade northern France across the English Channel, led a one-man campaign against Roosevelt's, the American generals, and many of his own generals' military plan to place all Western Allied efforts toward the cross-channel invasion. Churchill was adamant about the need to maintain a wider net of pressure on the German army before, during, and after the main operation in Normandy. He felt the best way to accomplish this goal, and at the same time increase the possibility of success of the cross-channel invasion, was to have the Western Allies execute multiple diversionary thrusts across Europe's southern periphery. Stalin and Roosevelt were opposed to the use of these distractions. The two leaders and their staffs felt that Churchill was not committed to Overlord and was simply buying time to allow Germany and the Soviet Union to wear each other down before the British stepped in to defeat an already weakened Germany and exert their influence over Europe. Although Churchill mistrusted Stalin and the Soviet Union, he did not desire to undermine Overlord. Churchill's periphery strategy was intended to engage German forces across the Mediterranean and divert German troops from northern France and Russia, thereby increasing the chances of success at Normandy and relieving pressure on the Red Army in the east. Furthermore, Churchill's periphery strategy had the purpose of limiting post-war Soviet influence in Eastern Europe and the Balkans by placing Allied troops in those regions. 4 years before the containment policy became the official policy of the United States, Winston Churchill was advocating for it at Tehran. When the Big Three leaders gathered at Tehran, Churchill stated that the room held the greatest concentration of power the world had ever seen. Roosevelt wrongly predicted of relations between the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union that our three great nations would work in close cooperation for the prosecution of the war and for generations to come. But Roosevelt's optimism was quickly replaced with contention among the Big Three's differing attitudes on the conduct of the war and the opening of a second front. Each of the leaders had their individual agendas to advance at the conference. Certainly, there were those objectives which were shared by each of them: the desire for Turkey to enter the war and the finalizing of strategic goals of an invasion to open another front, for instance. And yet, despite the narrow topic of conversation on military affairs, each of the Big Three came to Tehran with distinct political objectives. Stalin's goal was, first and foremost, to confirm a date that the Western Allies would invade Western Europe. For 2 years, Stalin had pressed Churchill and Roosevelt for relief from the German army, only to be rebuffed each time and told that an invasion would come in due time. Prior to Tehran, Stalin held the view that the Western Allies, particularly Churchill and the British, were not committed to Overlord. Stalin expressed disappointment with the Allied decisions to attack weaker flanks of the Axis territory in North Africa and the Mediterranean. The USSR's military gains in 1943 allowed Stalin the freedom, however, to demand an invasion date from the Western Allies. Stalin arrived at Tehran with both military and political momentum on his side. Simply put, Stalin controlled the affairs from the start. He astutely used the Soviets' military gains to bully Western allies into an Overlord timeline that fit with his expectations and planning of the war for 1944. Stalin's second objective at the conference, and possibly his most important, was to limit American and British involvement in Eastern Europe. regions that Stalin was determined would fall under Soviet influence after the war. Stalin's post-war plan for a Soviet sphere of influence over any territory liberated from the Germans was evident during the discussions at Tehran. Hiding Soviet territorial ambitions within the guise of strategic decisions meant to defeat Germany, Stalin made the Americans and British commit to landing in southern France, Operation Dragoon, and northern France, Operation Overlord, that would encircle Germany, but further ensured that British and American forces would be landing at the farthest points from the advancing Red Army, preventing Allied troops from contesting the Soviets for post-war control of the Balkans and Central Europe. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was less concerned with Europe's post-war power balance. He entertained two distinct goals at the conference, each one relating to Soviet-American relations. Roosevelt's first goal of the conference was to make a good impression on Stalin. Although the president had communicated with his Soviet counterpart for 3 years, the two men had never met. In letters Roosevelt wrote to Churchill, he said that he could, quote-unquote, manage Stalin. Roosevelt, however, fell into the trap of doing all he could to woo and impress Stalin. He was determined to make their relationship personal and friendly. He achieved this one night, and he described the interaction later by writing, "As soon as I sat down at the conference table, I began to tease Churchill about his Britishness, his John Bull, cigars, and about his habits. It began to register with Stalin. Winston got red and scowled, and the more he did so, the more Stalin seemed to smile. Finally, Stalin broke out into a deep, hearty guffaw. For the first time in 3 days, I saw light. From that time on, our relations were personal." The budding relationship between the two men allowed Roosevelt to openly discuss military options with Stalin. Roosevelt used his newfound friendship to accomplish a secondary goal of impressing upon Stalin that the United States, not Britain, would lead the amphibious assault on France. By waging war on two separate sides of the globe, even by the time of the Tehran Conference in the fall of 1943, America had not yet reached the greatest extent of her fighting strength. American divisions in Europe numbered less than half of British strength. The Americans, however, were quickly catching up and were on pace to surpass British in terms of manpower and industrial production. With the United States prepared to assume leadership of the Western European theater, Churchill, who always harbored doubts about Overlord, felt his political influence shrinking. Although Churchill lacked the military might of the United States or the Soviet Union, Churchill was focused on the long-term strategy of the war, knowing that the decisions made about the war's conduct at Tehran would influence the post-war world. At the conference, Churchill was determined to throw his remaining political weight behind strategies that would allow him to accomplish his personal post-war objectives. Toward this goal, Churchill spent much of his time at Tehran advocating for his periphery plan, which involved multiple coordinated thrusts across the Mediterranean by British and American forces. The multiple invasion periphery strategy had 3 purposes. The first goal was to strangle Germany into submission, World War I style. The second purpose was to defy German forces, thereby providing the landings in northern France a greater chance of success while relieving pressure on the Soviet Union at the same time. Churchill's third goal was to prevent the Soviet Union from occupying Central Europe and the Balkans. Churchill's plan called for diversionary thrusts of the Dodecanese Islands, the Balkans, mainly in Yugoslavia, northern Italy up to the Pisa-Rimini line, highlighted by the black line there, and one thrust through the north of the Adriatic Sea right here, landing at Trieste and going all the way up through with Vienna at the point of that arrow right there. Prior to and at Tehran, Churchill sought Stalin's and Roosevelt's approval for this periphery strategy, which would change the course of the war. In regard to the periphery, Churchill felt the first place for operations should be in the Balkans. In regard to the Balkans, he may have desired a military force to make inroads to the region, but any boots on the ground in southern Europe was opposed by the United States. American military planner, General Albert Cody Wiedemeyer, called Churchill's plans for the Balkans periphery packing. The American perspective was aligned toward a direct offensive against northern France. The United States did, however, consent to the supplying of the Yugoslav resistance. In the months prior to Tehran, Churchill insisted that small forays and supply missions be undertaken to ensure the Yugoslavs continued to tie down approximately 30 German divisions. At Tehran, Churchill advocated for this continued supply of the Yugoslav resistance, commanded not by a royalist, but by a communist, Joseph Broz Tito. Churchill's support of Tito and his partisans came at a personal cost. Churchill was a staunch anti-communist, but nevertheless, Tito's communist partisans served 2 valuable purposes. Number 1, protecting the right flank of the Allied armies in Italy, and number 2, continuing to tie down German forces in the Balkans. Churchill desired the Balkans, particularly Greece, be opened up for Allied intervention. At Tehran, Churchill believed that the best way to accomplish this was to capture the Dodecanese Islands, which Churchill felt would draw Turkey away from neutrality and into the war on the Allies' behalf. Churchill ordered a major offensive to capture the islands 1 month prior to the Tehran Conference. According to the Prime Minister, an invasion of the island of Rhodes, which is the largest island in the Dodecanese right there, would encourage Turkey to enter the war. To American politicians, this diversion was proof that Churchill was once again attempting to delay overlord in an venture that was typically Churchillian: bold, imaginative, opportunistic, and wholly unnecessary. While commander of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean, General Eisenhower supported the American position that Allied forces in the Mediterranean were already stretched thin by saying, "We must therefore choose between Rhodes and Rome, and to us it is clear that we must focus on the Italian campaign." Even Churchill's closest military advisors felt that the Dodecanese were all a misadventure. General Bernard Montgomery wrote of the campaign, "It has puzzled me a long time why we want to go start friggin' about in the Dodecanese." Despite lacking even a glimpse of American support, Churchill moved ahead with his plan to capture the islands, now using only British forces. In the end, Churchill's Dodecanese campaign failed miserably. The British lost 4,800 men, 6 destroyers, 2 submarines, and 10 smaller craft. The American refusal to support this campaign, Churchill's inability to convince Roosevelt of its necessity, and the ultimate failure of the campaign as a whole was a clear sign that Churchill's influence over the conduct of the war was waning in the autumn of 1943. Churchill, ever stubborn as he was, did not give up on his treasures to be found in the Dodecanese. At Tehran, Churchill redoubled his lobbying efforts regarding the need to capture the Dodecanese Islands, which he emphasized would take pressure off of the Soviet Union, the main goal of overlord anyway, and that these continued operations would require only 3 or 4 of a total of 25 divisions that might be available from the Mediterranean. British General Alan Brooke told the Allied leaders at Tehran the British were prepared to launch a second invasion of the Dodecanese. The Americans and Soviets, however, of course saw this as nothing more than another one of Churchill's attempts at delaying overlord in favor of his personal political ambitions. So when Roosevelt and Stalin dismissed renewed British ventures in the Dodecanese, it became apparent that Churchill's ability to conduct the war in the eastern Mediterranean was not just waning, but it disappeared completely. His influence, however, was not yet spent. He still had hopes for his periphery strategy, specifically operations in Italy and the Adriatic that would help strangle Germany prior to the execution of overlord and place Allied troops in Central Europe. Great debate about what to do with Italy permeated throughout the conference. At the first plenary meeting, Stalin stated that Italy had no further use to the Allies now that shipping was open throughout the Mediterranean. Stalin felt that Italy was far from the heart of Germany. The only direct route to Berlin lay through France. He believed it would be better to abandon the capture of Rome altogether, leave 10 divisions to hold the current line just south of Rome, and use the remainder of the invading force for an invasion through southern France. Furthermore, he felt that the possibility of continued operations in Italy, drawing troops away from overlord, would risk the possibility of that operation succeeding. Churchill agreed that Italy was nothing more than a stepping stone to the main offensive against Germany, but Churchill did not believe the Italian campaign should be abandoned altogether. Much to Stalin's frustration, Churchill insisted that a campaign against southern France could not take place prior to the capture of Rome. But Churchill favored not just the taking of Rome, but further northward advances. North of Rome were strategically important airfields that would permit a bombing campaign against southern Germany. In addition, Churchill saw the north of Italy as the staging area for an amphibious invasion at the head of the Adriatic Sea. In response to Stalin's apprehension regarding troops in Italy not being made available for overlord, Churchill assured him that the 35 divisions, 19 American, 16 British, being put toward overlord were completely separate from the divisions being used in the Mediterranean. Overlord was the first priority. 7 divisions had already been withdrawn from Italy to prepare for overlord even. Churchill wanted to use the remaining divisions in Italy for the capture of Rome and northward pushes toward the Pisa-Rimini line, indicated by the black line right there. In a rare show of agreement with Churchill's periphery strategy, Roosevelt actually favored further northward advances in Italy. These advances, in Roosevelt's opinion, would be necessary for offensives into southern France and the northern Adriatic. Roosevelt's idea for an amphibious landing at the head of the Adriatic took Churchill by surprise. Churchill had previously discussed these operations with General Eisenhower, who told him that the operation would be uncertain and sure to require large force and much time, and that the president would oppose the use of any U.S. forces in this region since he thought it was a morass. Equally, if not more so surprised by Roosevelt's sudden support for an Adriatic thrust were his advisors, both political and military. So shocked was Roosevelt advisor Harry Hopkins that upon mention of it repeatedly during the first plenary session, he panically scribbled a note to Admiral King saying, "Who's promoting this Adriatic business that the president continually returns to?" Exasperated at Roosevelt's continued insistence of this, King replied, "As far as I know, it's his own idea." Churchill quickly affiliated himself with Roosevelt's plan. Differences did exist between the two. Roosevelt favored a landing on the Istrian Peninsula at the base of the arrow, right there. But from there, he sought to drive eastward toward Romania to link up with the advancing Red Army. Churchill's plan followed the arrow, with the landing at the Istrian Peninsula and driving up to the Ljubljana Gap in Slovenia with Vienna to be captured as the main objective. Stalin opposed either of these Adriatic plans. He believed that Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, would be more effective of a diversion than Churchill's proposal for an advance through the Ljubljana Gap. With the designation of southern France, not the Adriatic, as Normandy's accompanying operation, Churchill's periphery plan was doomed and his political influence was spent. Stalin seized the moment of Churchill's weakness and bluntly asked the Prime Minister, "Do the British really support Overlord?" Churchill accepted the inevitable and replied, "Britain will hurl every ounce of her strength across the Channel toward Germany." Churchill's support for his periphery strategy led Stalin and Roosevelt to believe that the Prime Minister did not believe in Overlord. In reality, nothing could be farther from the truth. Churchill wanted each diversionary operation to be exactly that, diversions. These would ease Wehrmacht pressure on the Eastern Front and increase the chances of success of the Normandy operation, but they were never meant to be primary objectives. American dreams of a direct offensive through France and Soviet goals of expansion in the East doomed Churchill's periphery strategy before it ever got off the planning table. Churchill's support of the periphery plan and his counterpart's subsequent dismissal of it highlighted the complexities of politics in determining military strategy.